Skaldic poetry demands a skald and their audience have a depth of knowledge regarding Norse mythology. How else could one successfully employ those fancy kennings and understand their meanings? We also know that the art continued after the Viking Age and conversion. So, how did Christians remember all of that pagan lore? Well, to address that problem, a certain Icelandic historian and politician decided to write a handbook for the 13th century. Yes, we're talking about the infamous Snorri Sturluson and his Prose Edda. That work was written in Iceland around 1220 CE, and it served as a treatise on skaldic poetry in Old Norse, that being a formal work of writing that systematically addresses a particular topic. It seems that Snorri wrote it because, as saga literature was becoming more and more popular, skaldic poetry was increasingly seen as a dying art. As a skald himself, who occasionally praised Norwegian kings with his poetry, he didn't want to see the art fade away. Snorri therefore wanted to provide his society with an overview of Norse mythology so that they may continue to use and understand mythologically inspired kennings, a pillar of the skaldic tradition. This endeavor required him to cite both Eddic and skaldic poetry, lending his retelling of myth some credibility and providing examples for how kennings and meters actually worked. And the result for us? Exactly what we've been needing. So far, we've only had vague poetry to help us understand Norse mythology, and those often leave us confused or out of the loop. Well, Snorri's work gives us some much needed context by taking that poetry and telling us the stories behind them. It's only natural that we'd end up relying on his work, especially since we have little else to work with. He wasn't the first person to write about Norse mythology in prose, but he's certainly the most famous, or rather, infamous. That's not only a joke on the Saga Thing podcast, which I adore, but a real sentiment among those who study Norse mythology, both academically and spiritually. There's good reason for it, too. After all, why should we trust a Christian on matters concerning a pagan mythology? Indeed, like all sources, Snorri's Edda was a product of his time. We can't actually call it a Viking Age account of Norse mythology by a practicing pagan. Far from it. Snorri inevitably retells Norse mythology through a Christian lens, primarily because he's trying to make it relevant for a Christian audience. Although he generally presents Norse mythology with a detached, scholarly tone, he nevertheless frames it with Christian concepts, such as Euhemerism. Medieval authors typically applied Euhemerism in order to present the pagan past as a, quote, misguided groping towards the truth, end quote. By euhemerizing paganism, and thus providing a rationalization for pagans themselves, medieval authors hoped to still glean something useful from pagan philosophies and histories, rather than dismissing them altogether. After all, many pagan authors, such as Aristotle, played a huge role in shaping medieval thought. Here's an example of this technique from Snorri's Edda. Near the middle of the world was constructed that building and dwelling which has been the most splendid ever, which was called Troy. The name of one king there was Munon or Menon. He was married to the daughter of the high king Priam. She was called Troan. They had a son. He was called Tror. We call him Thor. Norse pagans clearly didn't believe that Thor was actually some dude from Troy. Yet this was Snorri's out, a way to make an excuse for himself and his audience so that they, as good Christians, could continue to enjoy Norse mythology without sinning. This doesn't mean that he intentionally altered Norse mythology, though. He was more interested in preserving it, not changing it. It's more like looking at it through a different window. Instead of seeing Norse mythology through a clear pane, as pagans might have, Snorri's Edda offers a glimpse at Norse mythology through a stained glass. But even then, his Euhemerism is hardly present throughout his Edda overall, so it's a faintly colored stained glass window at best. Only a few parts are obviously Euhemerized. The majority of his Edda, however, sounds more natural. Here's an example. Then spoke just as high. Ginnungagap, the part that faces in the northerly direction, was filled with the weight and heaviness of ice and rime, and there was a vapor and a blowing inwards from it. But the southerly part of Ginnungagap cleared up in the face of the sparks and molten particles that came flying out of the world of Muspel. Thus we learn a bit more about what Ginnungagap was actually like, possibly, rather than simply just Ginnungagap, as we had with the Eddic poem The Prophecy of the Seeress. So while some scholars rightfully note the potential that Snorri added Christian seasoning to pagan cuisine, we can rest assured that Snorri knew more about Norse mythology than we do, and was simply trying to keep it relevant for his Christianized society. Trust me, if he wanted to discredit Norse mythology, he would have presented all of the gods as demons to be purged from this earth with a generous helping of holy water. Plenty of sources do just that. Speaking of which, if you think Snorri was bad, just wait until you hear about this boy, Saxo Grammaticus. He was a contemporary of Snorri's who lived in Denmark in the late 12th and early 13th century. While also a historian, his background was more professionally Christian than Snorri's, so to speak. He worked as a clericus, that is a secretary, for an archbishop named Absalon, who presided over Lund Cathedral. He was also a canon, that is a member of clergy, of the cathedral chapter, and a magister, that is a teacher, at the cathedral school. In other words, unlike the secular-minded Snorri, Saxo was steeped in the realm of Christian teaching and authority, and his great contribution to Norse mythology, Gesta Danorum, reflects that background. Written in Latin, Gesta Danorum, or The History of the Danes, contains 16 books that cover the history of Denmark from its legendary beginnings to the late 12th century. That said, it's unsurprisingly more famous today for its first 9 books, which cover the mythological and legendary part of Denmark's history. Its medieval significance, however, was quite different. Like most medieval historians, Saxo staunchly believed that the main purpose for writing history was moral education. As influentially put by Isidore of Seville, a popular early medieval writer, quote, "Many wise people have imparted the past deeds of humankind in histories for the instruction of the living." In other words, Saxo frequently emphasizes that their ancestors were grossly misled by false deities with a healthy dose of Euhemerism. For instance, at that time, there was a man called Odin, who was believed throughout Europe, though falsely, to be a god. But wait, that's not so bad, right? Well, if that was all he had to say about it, then it really wouldn't be so bad. But Saxo was a salty boy. This is nothing compared to what he says later. I mean, he really drives this point in throughout his work. Consider the third time he goes on a tangent about this. At one time, certain individuals initiated into the arts of sorcery, namely Thor, Odin, and a number of others who were skilled at conjuring up marvelous illusions, clouded the minds of simple men and began to appropriate the exalted rank of godhead. Norway, Sweden, and Denmark were ensnared in a groundless conviction, urged to a devoted worship of these frauds, and infected by the smirch of their gross imposture. The results of their deception spread, so that all other realms came to revere some kind of divine power in them, believing they were gods, or the confederates of gods. They rendered solemn prayers to these magic mongers, and paid respect to an impious heresy, which should have gone to true religion. Yeah, pretty harsh. So while Snorri may have half-heartedly tried to link the gods to the Trojans in his Edda, Saxo viciously discredits them in the Gesta Danorum. Nevertheless, we shouldn't completely disregard this source. If used carefully and responsibly, it can still provide many interesting insights that are worth exploring, especially in conversation with other material.